Faith Harris, Executive Director for Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, and I'm really excited to be here this evening. We've had 2 days of really great speaking, wisdom, fellowship, community, and learning together. And I think that we are creating a cadre of folk who can go out into the community and provide good information, inspiration, and hope to so many who are experiencing the impacts of climate change and who in some ways feel a sense of hopelessness and are experiencing the grief of this very heavy burden of how do we respond to this challenge of our lifetime, and actually probably the challenge of our century. I have the great privilege of introducing our speaker this evening, Dr. Melanie L. Harris. She is a professor of Black feminist thought and womanist theology, jointly appointed with Wake Forest School of Divinity, and the African American Studies program at Wake Forest University. Dr. Harris is also the director of the Food, Health, and Ecological Well-Being program. A graduate of Harvard Leadership Program, Dr. Harris is a former American Council of Education Fellow and founding director of TCU African American and Africana Studies program. Her research and scholarship critically examines intersections between race, religion, gender, and environmental ethics. She is the author of many scholarly articles and books, including Gifts of Virtue, Alice Walker and the Womanist Ethics, Palgrave, Eco-Womanism, Earth Honoring Faith, Orbis, and co-editor of Faith, Feminism, and Scholarship, The Next Generation by Palgrave, as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters. Dr. Harris earned her PhD and MA degrees from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, and MDiv from Iliff School of Theology, and a BA from Spelman College. And I came to know her actually through the AAR opportunities to hear her speak during the AAR in November every year. But I also started, when her book, Eco-Womanism and Earth Honoring Faith, was published, I started using it in my classes. And I told her earlier, and I have to say that so many of the students found her methodology of eco-memory and writing your eco-memory, recognizing and kind of unearthing stories and experiences and lessons learned from mothers, grandmothers, and fathers. So both males and females in my classes enjoyed the book, learned how to tap into what they often called as their latent environmentalism, recognizing that they were born into families that had a connection to the earth, had a connection to the environment, and that in some ways it was subdued, but that they had learned at their mothers' and grandmothers' knees how to be in fellowship and communion with earth. And so we're really grateful to have her here with us this evening. She has already provided great wisdom, and she shared her music and her mind with us already this afternoon, and so we look forward to what she will bring this evening. So I will get out the way and let Melanie Harris take over the mic.
Collaboration between all of the partners. Thank you so much for being willing to take a risk for Earth justice. It really can show up as love in the world, and certainly love on the planet, which is what we need now more than ever. I want to thank Hillary especially for the hospitality. It's really been a gift to be able to be here, and so many powerful hearts. We've had an extraordinary time today and also on last evening. It was a gift indeed to be with Norman And so I want to thank you. He and I are good friends in the work of ecological justice, and so it's always nice to work with a friend. They know you and you know them, so I'm really grateful that the flow of the afternoon was evidence of friendship. Won't you open your hearts and allow us to enter into this time together with a moment of reflection and prayer. The calling of earth and the hearing of wisdom takes courage and a settledness of mind, body, and spirit. Eco-womanism honors that way of being. It is an invitation, essentially, to notice earth, to be in the fullness of earth's grace and spirit and flow. The contemplative step of noticing earth shows up in a variety of different religious traditions. We know those traditions as prayer and ritual, sitting, meditating. And one of the gifts of being able to walk contemplatively is to slow down. When we slow down, we hear. We are able to hear earth, and from an African cosmological perspective, to hear all the beings connected to earth. So as I stand in this sacred place, I listen with you for earth and for the ancestral spirit and strength of Katie Cannon and the many ancestors connected to this powerful heart union, theological, ethical, biblical, critical inquiry into not just the nature of God, the reality of humanity, but the power of what weaves us, the earth. These theological questions that bring us all to this particular space have deep responses from us all. And that's important in part because all of us are different. We bring different memory, eco-memory, to the space to talk out and to be fully flourishing beings in this time. Slowing down, we recognize even the anxiety that comes up in us when we hear an earth memory that may be jarring or uncomfortable for us. Slowing down, we can recognize a little bit of racial discomfort when we hear about the image of lynching. Slowing down, we recognize the eeriness of the repetitiveness of violence throughout the world and the impact that that has on Mother Earth. Slowing down, we breathe. If only just a little bit of hope into our beings again. Eco-womanism is a space of reflection, a way of being with the earth that allows this hope to continue to grow and expand, even as we sit with the uncomfortable. I've shared earlier today the kind of clear definition of eco-womanism, and I'll do a little bit tonight of walking through the method. Eco-womanism is essentially approaches to environmental ethics or climate justice that really centers the voices of women of African descent. This is particularly important because women of African descent have contributed much to the work of environmental justice throughout history. We might not hear about the fullness of their stories when we recall the environmental movement leaders such as Emerson and Thoreau. We may not imagine that Black women such as Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, their narratives wove an eco-memory, an eco-womanist path way before many of the movement workers in the 1960s and 70s. Eco-womanism does the work of uncovering these particular women's voices, their contributions, the science, the technology, the ways of being, and the religious understandings and spiritual practices that these women embody as a way of combating, so to speak, climate injustice. So it is significant to be able to bring together and glean wisdom from these women of African descent. I'll name some, many of whom you already know. Wangari Maathai, leader and founder of the Green Belt movement, the eco-womanist writings of Alice Walker, the intersectional environmentalist work of Leah Thomas. The ethical models that these and other women offer us through their life work and through their spiritual activism informs the work of eco-womanism and, more broadly, the work of life, peace building, gleaning ways of relating and working collaboratively and studying the ways that collective movement is similar to what we notice in ecosystems, recognizing this collective, collaborative work as key for community organizing. Eco-womanism takes note. The goal of eco-womanism, in part, is to shape earth-honoring ethical ways of being that are highly relational and take seriously the recognition that the earth is sacred. Birthed through the noticing of our oneness and interbeing, eco-womanist scholarship is interdisciplinary. It crosses channels of theory and practice, environmental science, life work, scholarship, spirituality, religious orientation, collaborative leadership styles, all embodied often by women. In a time of climate change, this kind of scholarship puts together theory and praxis. So it is important to recognize that in many indigenous cultures and in many African indigenous religious traditions, that to think fragmented, separate from being, acting, creates more disconnect. That the life of the mind is the full life of the body. To echo the work of Norman and the sharing on last night, there is something powerful about leaning into the spirit, about releasing dualisms and walking into new frames of the non-dual. The call of earth cannot be explained as just one feel or just one tone. Is this the voice of the mother, the whale, the platypus, Is this the voice of coral? Or are they all the same voice? As we listen, we hear ourselves and each other. Recognizing the sacredness of earth invites us indeed to recognize the sacredness of ourselves and the sacredness of each other. A very central understanding in indigenous culture and religious tradition. It is important to recognize that eco-womanism considers this as the base, the innate divinity that is in all Black women, the innate divinity that is in all beings. And for the sake of the Academy, it becomes important to focus on the voices of Black women, indigenous women, people of color. Why? Well, long time ago, these were the voices that were silenced. But not killed. She did not die. In fact, she lived. Many of the she's lived and survived and found a way to sing and keep on singing. This power of resilience is holy. Eco-womanism is about resilience. It is about understanding not just the self and being as sacred, but to recognize that the practice of uncovering Black women's voices is also the practice of revolution. It is coming into the full counter-narrative of a hegemonic culture that might think it was wise to silence other voices. Breaking out, breaking into truth is the work of eco-womanism. I want to invite you into a bit more of the non-dual realities of indigenous religious tradition and help us to recognize this revolutionary spirit, this resilient spirit of eco-womanism. Eco-womanism begins with the conceptual frame that indeed is non-dual, anti-racist, anti-colonial, decolonial in many ways, but always focusing on indigenous culture and indigeneity, non-hierarchical. It is as if it is the experience of God's love that encourages us and wants us all to thrive. It recognizes that each of us have a way in and have our own earth song. The first step of the eco-womanist method is to honor your earth song, to honor your own eco-memory. So, for many of my students, it's an invitation to go back into their lives, into their memories, and to remember their first encounter with earth as sacred. Sometimes the language of God is used when you saw God in nature. When you experience the kind of oneness in the way that Shug Avery in The Color Purple by Alice Walker talks about, kind of oneness with all of earth, whereby if a tree was cut, her own arm would bleed. Believe it or not, you have an eco-memory. Beginning to unpack that eco-memory is the movement of the eco-womanist method. The second step invites us to reflect on that experience. Honest noticing. I noticed that the leaves were yellow in that season. I noticed that the grief in my heart was lightened by the reflection of spaciousness in the sky. I noticed that the flower color spoke to me more than the texture. This quiet noticing is what we also might consider a contemplative move, a spiritual path. So this is not just theory. It is spiritual practice to reflect, to honor. We move in this third step into deeper intersectional analysis. Womanist analysis that Katie Cannon and so many other confessional womanists laid before us. Black feminist frames of asking the hard question, what does race have to do with this situation? Where does gender show up? Are there places where economic status becomes a barrier to receiving care? This tripartite analysis is where we begin, but it is not where we stop. In fact, the second and third generations and fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh generations of womanist thought will expand those categories quite broadly, so that it becomes important to be inclusive of questions around queer identity, disability, access to care, geographical age and ageism, ableism. To understand that in our democracy, there is a real tension around one's political ideology, and that the framing of that ideology may hinder or allow for relationship. Taking all of those pieces into account and asking the hard questions about where racism, classism, sexism shows up in the examples of environmental racism in our own communities is the third step of eco-womanist method. Now, we could stop there. There is enough work for us to just stop and rest in the intersectional analysis in the eco-womanist method. And many do. Many of my students do. They don't get A's, but they do stop at step 3. The gift of the eco-womanist method is that it is a spiral. It is not shaped as a linear method, but it works as a spiral, whereby one might enter into step 1, but it could be that one enters at step 3 or step 7, and then proceeds to go through the different steps in a different order. Radical for method, you say? Well, ask anyone who's ever been a caregiver of any other being if they could afford to do everything linearly. It is a gift to be able to see from multiple perspectives, to have many different ways in. So even the shape of the eco-womanist method allows for many entries into environmental justice work. The fourth step gives us pause because it invites us to critically examine our own traditions. Now, as you can imagine, as a Methodist, examining one's own tradition comes with strings attached. In the work of eco-womanism, we often go back to the real sources for eco-womanist spirituality, the understandings that we have theologically at our base of our relationship between humans and the earth. For example, He's got the whole world in His hands. 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 Are we talking about Musk here, or? Here's another. I am a poor pilgrim of sorrow. I walk through this whole earth alone. I have no hope for tomorrow. I want to make heaven my home. A home in heaven, by and by. Deep, deep spirituals from the African American tradition are built on dualisms. And why? To escape the terror of white racist violence. To escape with some notion of psychological unity embodied. To leave behind what they try to kill. To get into such a state of mindfulness that one is surrounded by total peace. And you are right. James Cone would say, true liberation is for the body, the spirit, the soul, and the mind. Without all of these realities as a part of the liberational frame, then the gospel falls apart. We fall astray, out of alignment with God's will to free all people, black peoples, brown peoples, peoples of color, and all peoples. So this fourth step, as difficult as it is, requires us to go back to our sources and to ask the questions, where does hierarchy show up in our structures, in our leadership, in our administration structures? Where does hierarchy show up, and where is it actually not helpful to move the vision of environmental justice forward? The fifth step invites us to recognize that we are not the only ones in this conversation, particularly as those who identify with the work and path of Christ. Engaging transformation means practicing a kind of openness, a hearing and deep listening, not only to earth, but to ourselves and to each other. It means that many of us have to be open to the Spirit to be transformed in our hearts and minds. So, if we are to use the Christian tradition as a way of getting in and practicing eco-womanism, we recognize that the discipline of prayer and confession and repentance are important. Because I believe some things only come by prayer and fasting. That the full transformation of an entire culture wrapped in the paradigm of white supremacy may not happen without prayer. Engaging the hope that that transformation can take place. Engaging the work that that kind of transformation can take place. Engaging the practice of looking yourself in the mirror every day and saying, I am an anti-racist, I will love, I do practice unconditional acceptance of other beings. All of these practices transform the heart and way of life. Being open to that kind of transformation happens often in eco-womanism by being in dialogue with others. So that the sixth step of sharing dialogue is crucial. Now, those of you who are familiar with liberation theologies and feminist theologies know that this dialogue, committee meeting after committee meeting after committee meeting after committee meeting, is crucial. Not always to develop a consensus, but to practice listening to each other and hearing. So that sharing dialogue is not hearing your own self speak, but practicing deep listening. Here is where Thich Nhat Hanh and many of our Buddhist colleagues and friends are very, very helpful. To sit in silence and listen, really listen to another without thinking about what you're going to say next and bringing it up in your mind as they are moving their mouths. To really sit and listen takes remarkable discipline and practice. And it is required for heart-to-heart sharing, deep, deep dialogue. So, let's practice. Let me invite you to come to a good sitting position wherever you are. You might stretch out your feet just a little bit, shake your toes. Come to whatever is a comfortable seated position for you. And we'll bring in the breath. So one way to do this is to roll the shoulders back just to make sure you're in full alignment. When you're ready, you can bring your feet to a comfortable position. Allow some energy to come to your tailbone and your sitting bones. Allow your chin to fall so that your neck feels comfortable. And together, we will breathe in 3 times, very deeply, and then listen. I invite you to breathe out any stale air. When you're ready, you can take a deep inhalation, breathing in very fully. Allow the breath to fully enter the lungs, and when you're ready, you can exhale. Just take a moment to notice here how you're feeling. When you're ready, you can breathe out again any stale air. Go ahead and take a deep breath in, breathing very fully. Even imagine light entering into your lungs and dancing. When you're ready, you can exhale. We'll just take a moment to notice here, massage the muscles of listening. We'll take a third breath by exhaling first any stale air. When you're ready, you might breathe in the true breath of God, Ruach, in this moment in time. Allow that spaciousness to enter your lungs, really feel it in your body. And when you're ready, you can exhale. Just take a moment to notice here. Now we'll just allow sound as it comes. I'll hold the time just about a minute, and we'll go into this practice of deep listening. Thank you. What did Earth say to you? Did you feel the Spirit? How did it feel to really listen? To be in full communion with Earth community is to be in this kind of communion, in the fullness of ourselves, in the fullness of our bodies, in the fullness of Earth. This too, my friends, is action. This contemplative way of being, of slowing down, is also environmental justice work. Because the wisdom that comes upon this opening is often the full strategic plan for environmental justice, for church, for faith community, for one's life, for wholeness, for family, and more. The seventh step of the Eco-Womanist method is indeed to take action for earth justice, to recognize that social justice is earth justice and earth justice is social justice. If we keep on doing the things that we have done before, we will not be in the places where we need to be when things get really, really, really tough. Future directions of eco-womanism look not just to building out these practices, but also embodying a deep awareness and teaching around honoring beings as sacred. Self-love, self-compassion, and planetary care go hand in hand, and this is important. It's one of the teachings that Buddhists give to womanists. That this sense of emptiness in Buddhism speaks profoundly, even to the Christian womanist, about cherishing and honoring the self. Now you can imagine in a society where oppressions and multi-layered oppressions are rampant, that a person of color, a woman of color, a black girl, child grows up in an atmosphere where she is taught to understand herself as inferior. So the reclaiming of her mind, the reclaiming of her spirit, the reclaiming and correction is embedded in her religious and spiritual formation. And she is not the only one. Many peoples of color have internalized the muck and the lies. We call it internalized oppression. Often inviting people of color, women of color, into the full spaciousness of earth is the medicine, the unlocking from within to see ourselves clearly. This unlocking is healing. It is the healing power of earth. It is the healing power of the energy to undo the impact of trauma. So that a part of eco-womanism is not just theory, not just practice, but it is medicine. Not just for people of color, but for anyone who has been taught that they are not enough. You are enough. And you are loved. These gospel truths, as basic as they sound, are 1, 2, 3, 4 of the most important messages of freedom in our time. You want to combat mental health crisis? Share the truth of love. Invite people into earth communion. Create a refuge space out of the space you've got in your church. Invest in organizations that are doing the work of environmental justice and unhooking people from the lie that hierarchies are better. And sit with yourself. Sit with yourself. Sit with yourself, all of yourself, and bear it all. Earth heals. Eco-womanism is one way of engaging that healing. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I am so grateful for your presence, deep presence in this time. I want to invite some Q&A. So as you feel led, and I'm sure I'll have some help with finding a mic, please feel free to engage your questions, and we can have some shared conversation together.
When you were inviting us to deep listening, I know I'm in a room full of wonderful people. I know this room was built with wonderful intentions.
Oh, we have to make the mic.
Okay. I'm in a room with wonderful people.
Oh, let's make sure it's working. It is on? Okay. Do you want to use this lavalier?
I'll try. I'm not sure it's working.
There we are.
I'm in a room with wonderful people, in a room that was built to be wonderful, to hold wonderful things. I hear the drone of a machine. I do not feel the earth. And that makes me sad. And because I think so many of us live cut off physically from something we need physically.
Thank you. Sure, I'm happy to restate the question. Thank you. It was a beautiful reflection on the deep listening practice that we did together, and an articulation of hearing a drone, like a mechanical drone, instead of a kind of peace, a feeling of peace or groundedness to the earth. I think you are tapping into a tone of grief that many of us know very well. And I think earlier I was talking to someone about the healing opportunity. Sometimes we have to place ourselves in deep spaces of earth communion, like you really do need to do practice with the heartbeat of a tree in order to heal yourself enough, right, and to reshape the ear. I've written extensively on the ear, in part because we can become so conditioned to only hearing just the drone, or only hearing a particular voice in the pulpit, or only hearing the register of a male voice rather than a female voice. Right? Scientifically, it's been proven that actually, for many humans, it is actually hard to hear, more difficult to hear a woman's voice. So that the reshaping of the ear becomes important. How do you reshape your ear? It's like the engaging transformation. It's reshaping your heart, right? To put yourself, if you have any kinds of means, into a space where there are just trees, yeah? So these practices, we call them spiritual practices, but tree bathing, very, very real. Spiritual bathing, many of these come out of African indigenous or indigenous traditions. Some of them are Celtic. They go back, long, long ways. But some of us, I know I sometimes feel very silly out there with the trees kind of humming, sort of, kind of. And I think if we take it seriously, we can actually heal ourselves enough to then be able to be active citizens in the earth. And I appreciate you naming the grief. One of the gifts I think that Buddhism gives us is to be able to learn how to sit with grief, how to allow grief to be transformed so that it opens us to wisdom, so that it's not a practice of engaging depression, right, or re-traumatizing the mind, but it's actually inviting sorrow for tea. So you invite the sorrow in, you invite the lynching scene in, you invite those from racial violence in, you invite the mob in, the madness, the chaos into a spaciousness of mind, knowing that it's held by the ultimate bowl or God's love. You invite it in and you ask, what is the teaching here? What is the wisdom here? And if the drone is speaking anything, it is saying, I am here, I am eating the planet, and I will eat your ear. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
I'm pretty loud, so I think I probably don't need a mic. As you were speaking, I thought of, I believe her name is, you still want me to do it? Okay. As you were speaking, I think her name is Arthur Cole Riley, Black Liturgies, and she talks about rest and resistance, and so many of the things that she writes are very moving. At the same time, as a woman of white, a person of white and privilege, I feel sort of guilty, disingenuous. This is not, I don't want to take her experience and go, oh, that works for me too. It's not my experience. So, do you have any suggestions for a person of white that is moved by and inspired by women such as yourself and Arthur Cole Riley, and how to learn from without co-opting and taking one more thing?
Yeah.
It doesn't take so long.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. I'm grateful for the mothers who have led me into this same conversation. Katie Cannon had the same conversation with Letty Russell. Letty Russell had the same conversation with Mercy Oduyuye. These conversations have been going on for a long time. Oftentimes, it's important to raise in every moment. It's a question of appropriation. And particularly when we're working with people of color, women of color, black women, and indigenous women, it's a question that many times comes up from white folks who are wrestling with and growing in their shedding of white privilege. So I will answer from the bloodstreams that are in my own veins. In this society, I'm not named as white. I am the descendant of sharecroppers and slaves. And so a part of my bloodline is white, based on the reality of rape and violence of white slave masters over black women's bodies. So I can answer from that vantage point, literally from the ancestors in my own line who are white and still seeking healing. There is something radically important about noticing the feeling in the body when there is uncomfortable. Like you feel like, I think I would love to lean into that, but something is telling me I shouldn't. That something is a part of the consciousness, the racial consciousness, that's saying, you might be appropriating, you might be appropriating, you might be appropriating, so stop. Pause deeply and listen, and do just as you've modeled. Ask a question to a person of color and say, is this appropriation? How would you feel about this? I think oftentimes in anti-racist spaces and seminary contexts, there's a lot of space for conversation than for a person of color to say, yeah, I feel that's total appropriation. Or, yeah, you need to take a nap. In the way that we've just practiced an eco-womanist methodology, everyone took a nap here. Everyone rested. In part because the eco-womanist method opens itself up. It focuses on black women, but it opens itself up as a method and a practice to be able to give earth rest, which is renewing and healing, to everyone. But it does so with an expectation. You have to go into your own eco-memory. You can't go into mine. So that anyone who's not a person of color has to wrestle with that first step of going into the eco-memory, not just of one's own childhood or one's experience, but also what does it mean to be a part of a people who in this country have been known to be the ones who led the genocides, to be the ones who led the violence, to be the ones, and we know from a lot of anti-racist work, it's not enough to say, well, it wasn't me. but to step into how might I heal the ancestors in my own bloodline. They might need a lot of love. A lot. Oodles and oodles of love and forgiveness and compassion. And it could be that the people of color beings around you don't have that to give. So you may have to go to the forest. You may have to go to other beings and reorient yourself as you see fit. Here's a very clear way of instructing. White people have the capacity to love themselves whole. James Baldwin called it doing your own work first. A lot of our racial dialogue in this country assumes that white people don't have the capacity, but they do. I've seen it. I've been loved by a lot of white people who really love me, which is great. But the capacity of their spiritual maturity to do so requires them to have a practice of loving themselves and loving the hatred out of their own bloodline. So I realize this is a sacred spiritual space and I'm talking on all these spiritual levels. I hope that makes sense and that you can receive that. But a basic way of answering that question, in my experience in doing anti-racist work and being in friendships, hard friendships, sometimes broken friendships with white people, is a recognition that the self-love has to be present. If one is a trauma survivor, as I am, you have to deal with your trauma before you can join forces and do, protest work for environmental justice. Otherwise, your trauma is going to spew out on all the congregants and all the people. So taking the step back, slowing down, taking these, practices really seriously, we can all do the work and God's grace is sufficient. And when the angel says to you, baby, you need to sit down and take a nap, then it's wise to listen to that. I hope that helps. I am not white in this country, but that would be my response. And find some white people. There are some out there. Find some good white people who are doing the work of interrogating their own racism every day. And it is a slog. It is a struggle. It is very painful. And it's likely that you may lose friends on the journey. And that, too, is a part of the path. Yeah. Okay, 2 more hands, 3 more hands. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Sometimes the community looks different. Sometimes in my experience of my spiritual journey, I've looked up for 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, same group of friends. Year 6, those friends are gone. And it's almost as if there's been a pruning. And then the Spirit ushers in new people, new beings. My son wants a dog, for example, which I'm not so keen on. But there are echoes for new beings to come into our lives, so being aware of that. I think Bell Hooks' instruction here is really key. She writes that, that great chapter in Sisters of the Yam, Black Women in Self-Recovery, on touching the earth. And, Bell Hooks She was raised in Kentucky, raised in a Christian home, Black Baptist traditional home, such as was Tina Turner, as was Alice Walker, as was so many different people. And actually for Bell Hooks, it was a turn towards Buddhism that helped her to open up to new friends and new colleagues and new community. These turnings, as she will talk about it, are crucial for the recovery of the self. And so she will actually invite us to develop a self-care plan, especially if you're an activist, to really envision for yourself, when can I retreat? How can I retreat this year? So the radical commitment is 4 retreats a year. And oftentimes those retreats are, 3 to 4 days long, sometimes longer. Most people I know in spiritual direction are able to do 2 retreats. But to really seriously put those retreats in your schedule and to really create them as sacred so that you can be replenished, sometimes by earth community, going to the redwoods, being in North Carolina forest, really being with your garden, these kinds of things. But sometimes it is going to a conference where you know you're going to see other BIPOC people working in environmental justice. Going to Samuel Witt Proctor Conference, for example, is a huge retreat, oftentimes for me. And it's not necessarily that I keep in touch with those people every single day of the year, but being intentional about our self-care, I think oftentimes creates more community. And then just as you were doing, and I think I'm learning to do that too, as activists in any movement work, oftentimes we have been presented with models of solo leadership. So that's what we think we ought to be, praying at the midnight hour, fussing, not sleeping. We actually think that that's the norm because that's what King did. He was up all night, coffee in the hand, kitchen table, that's where he meets the spirit. So we actually think that's what we're supposed to do every night. But that's not what we're supposed to do every night. In many, many different senses in environmental justice, it is going to be key that you're rested and at peace. So if you're on a part, and I think we all are in different ways, a part of the journey where you feel like, am I burnt out or am I tired? It is that that's your body saying, actually, you need a different community. So when the wisdom has been offered to me, it's been hard for me to hear. Yeah. So I offer that with also the grace to shape the ear so that it can be heard. Yeah. And especially if you have, partners in life who you can be honest with and say, I need some accountability here. So you can say, by the time Christmas comes, I really need you to hold me accountable to going away, at least for one weekend or one spell. So I'm not looking at your partner, but there might be an invitation there. Yes. And I know we're at time, so I want to honor people's schedule.
So I am a garden worker at Lula. So thinking about what you're talking about with earth memory, connecting it to epigenetics and maternal mortality crisis, and talking about what our first eco memory is. I'm thinking about speaking to Willow Tree, my grandmother's yard, around the time the Pocahontas movie came out, that became a real friend to me. And then 2 summers later, go visit my grandparents in that tree cut down without any explanation other than the tree was big. And how every time now I'm going to their yard and feeling some sort of pain. And so I wonder if what you would suggest, spiritual practices, a way to heal that collective trauma and memory by just sitting with earth as a companion and learning by just paying attention. What do you think how that could be a way to look like?
I think you've just named it beautifully, sitting with the earth as companion. I was so encouraged. Norman was sharing earlier about the tree that had fallen near their home and how he and his wife wept, and how the arborist was willing to go with their grieving process before moving forward. So in an eco-womanist sense, it would be very appropriate to do a ritual for the tree and to invite whatever pores, whatever parts of your own DNA are in grief, to allow there to be spaciousness to honor that grief and that loss, and to basically say, I see you. I see you, grieving heart. I see this connection that you had with this tree. I notice you, and I notice you're grieving. I have often practiced the opposite, where I drown the feeling in Starbucks coffee. And that does not work, because it puts me on a constant spiral, right? That's not good for my body, but it also puts me in a constant spiral of practicing ignoring grief. And so then I feel dead inside because I haven't attended to this emotional trauma. Trauma is not a bad word. It's important to recognize that. I think particularly as faith keepers in this time, this day and age, we are going to see enormous trauma. And a lot of it will be coming out more because of the impact of climate change. And as leaders, we have to understand the brain, know the neurological capacities and teachings, how we can reshape the mind in many ways through deep, deep practice. I'm one who really believes in honoring the actual religious tradition, so I'm not so much a mindfulness practitioner as much as I am a Christian who learns a lot from actually studying Buddhist practice and Dharma talks and honoring the Buddha. That is a part of my native cosmology. I'm part Cherokee and also Blackfoot. And so in my way of being, it's important to honor that there are lots of ways into the divine. Now that's me, right? And honoring the spiritualities and the religious practices of that. And even if we don't know them, right? I think this is part of the gift of the study, of the seminary space, of the church space. The Bible is a powerful source. As it turns out, it's not the only source that can lead you to have a relationship or deepen a relationship with God. It's wonderful to walk the whole church through the Psalms. It's wonderful to preach a series on salvation. And it's also important to bring in the poets and the activists and the imams. It's important to bring these because they do have an extraordinary way of deepening the faith and deepening our faith in ways that we may not have known about it. So all that's to say, you don't have to be an expert to know what the ritual is. You'll feel it. You'll know what to do. Often it involves water or libations. So there's some, basic practices that many of us know. Putting your toe in water. For anyone who practices yoga or has ever practiced yoga, one of the things I realized is that you can really heal fatigue by washing your feet. You really can. So there's some really basic things out there that we can do. Tea instead of coffee. I'm still working on that part. Thank you for the question. And as a doula, I'm sure you know the depth of that moment and the many moments of birthing and rebirthing. The energy is what one can keep in mind, the energy of birth, on how to shape a practice around that. That would be a direction to go, or a goal, so to speak, to try to get back into that birth energy. I saw one more hand, and then we'll have to close. Yeah. I don't know who was first here. Oh, okay, 2 more hands. Mhm.
seems to be deeper than this space.
Mhm.
If we look around this whole room, we've left that original mother, which comes from the space of Africa, the
Mhm. Mhm.
Lucy. And I'm not, if we want to heal, we've got to recognize that she's been abandoned.
Mm.
So that's where that's where this.
Ah, that's good. That's great. That's great. I know you're writing a second book. This might be the subject. I think your comment makes me think of a few things. I'll just name two. One of the invitations that Vincent Harding always gave in his teaching was to invite all the students to name their full name, the place of their birth, and their work, and then to name the maternal grandmother, her full name, and her work, so as to basically get the ancestors in the room, so that there was a shifting of the cosmology, even from the very beginning of the class. And even if you didn't understand ancestors, you recognize that there were all these other energies in the room, that not just silent scripts about race or class or gender or sexuality, but there were also ancestors. It was a sacred presence. The classroom was a sacred presence. What I hear in your comment is the intentional awareness of Lucy, which to me communicates a oneness of all beings, so that racism falls away. And we're not caught in the dualism or the disillusion, the illusion rather, that we're all different. But boy, wouldn't this country love for us to believe that we cannot get along and that the oneness isn't there. So I appreciate the call out for, I don't know that I think that the practices actually reconnect. I don't know that they abandon. I think they reconnect us to each other. It's a deep leaning into spirit. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for the question. That's a brave question. Thank you. I have been doing more research, and many scientists have for a long time. As it turns out, many plants are queer. Yep. Many trees are queer. Many animals are queer. And this reality for eco-womanism creates a queer lens that is crucial as a teaching for human beings with each other. It goes back into this deep teaching about radical love and community and reshaping our theologies, to recognize the queerness in nature, to recognize the beauty and the way that God breathed in, that created nature as queer. That to me signals something really profound in terms of the connection between at least eco-womanism, in my view of it, and queer theory and queer thought and queer being and life. That's life-affirming and inclusive. I also hear in your question a larger question about LGBTIQ life and how to honor that in faith spaces. I think the reality is that as faith leaders, particularly shaped by Christian thought, we have often gotten caught in this dualism separating the body from the spirit. And in separating the body, we've been taught to separate our sexualities from our ways of being and our ways of life. That has been detrimental to Christian thought and community across the planet. It has been detrimental to children who practice and grow up in Christian communities. It has been detrimental and destructive to indigenous children. So this hiding of sexuality, we know, has been unhelpful and destructive to the Christian way of life, or Christian way of being. That being said, I also know that there's a lot of homophobia normative in our Christian churches. And it's in everything, from who we invite to the pulpit, to the literature we use for children's curriculum, to the way we understand the manger scene at Christmas time. Those messages speak profoundly to our congregants, to people, to communities, to our families, to ourselves, about who belongs and who doesn't belong. So the part of the gift of seminary, right, in some ways, is to start thinking about critical ways to examine and to interrupt those heteronorms, using theological language, using the Bible, using all kinds of beautiful sources, but to really interrupt those heteronorms, in part because they kill people. They kill black people, actually. They do. They kill brown people. They kill children, actually. That's my opinion. I think that then what becomes important is the healing balm. You know, how do churches, how do faith communities create safe spaces for LGBTIQ people? And for many of us, ministers included, me included, that means relearning how to take gender out of my language, right? How to reread the Bible, or how to think about all the trans children who may be in the congregation, who may have gone through hell during the week at school. And so by the time Sunday comes, there needs to be some refuge space, some language of theological care and love. And that's a challenge. To me, that's my point of privilege. I was raised as a heteronormative black woman, went to Spelman, expected to marry a Morehouse man. And so the norms on my own, in my own experience, show up. And that's the me I have to face in the mirror every morning, is to recognize that the privileges that I have led and walked in my life, they actually limit the life power of many, many queer folk. So tearing down that privilege, recognizing the harm that privilege, that's an everyday walk for me. Thank you for asking the question.